you in the morning in the city foursquare, when I crossed over Jordan so fair. What a wonderful meeting in that sweet home on high. I will meet you.
I want to talk tonight about the beauty of God's creation. I think it's pretty appropriate as we start thinking about Thanksgiving of the many things we have to be thankful for. And as we do those, as we think of those things, we might not always consider the creation as a gift to be thankful for. You know, we're thankful for our family, for our jobs, for our homes, and various different things like that. But I want to propose to you that one of the things we should be thankful for is God's creation. And there's probably no better piece of literature in the Bible to express that than Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is a poetic rendering of the creation story. The creation story takes several books of Genesis. The author of this psalm manages to do it in 35 verses, so it's pretty concise. And another reason I picked Psalm 104 is because it happens to be one of my favorite psalms. And when you're the teacher, you get to pick what you want to talk about. The reason it's one of my favorites is because if you remember a couple lessons ago, I think it was maybe a month ago or so, I had a lesson about Christian meditation. We were talking about all the things that we can and should meditate on and what meditation means. And if you remember from that talk, we learned that the word meditation actually means to turn in the mind. So you take an idea, you take something, and you really look at it from all different angles. You really study it carefully. And that's what I want to do with Psalm 104 today. Plus, as I mentioned with another psalm that I did, I think a couple of weeks ago, the poetic beauty of the Psalms is something to behold. This one is no exception. And finally, the imagery that this particular poem shows, to me, is very indicative of God's greatness, especially in regards to His creation. So, let's get started. By way of introduction, this psalm is not exactly, scholars aren't exactly sure who wrote it. Many and most think that it was David, but it's not quite as clear that David wrote this one as some of the other ones, which actually say a Psalm of David on the top. But in my opinion, it sounds a lot like David's other psalms. It's very poetic. It's had a lot of imagery, a lot of figurative language. So I would not be surprised if it was written by David. So before we start picking it apart, turn in your Bible with me to Psalm 104. I'm going to be reading from the King James because as far as poetry goes, I think the King James is the best version to read from. It's just very poetic. So Psalm 104. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty. Who coverest thyself with light as with a garment? Who stretchest out the heavens like a curtain? Who layeth the beams of his chambers in the waters? Who maketh the clouds his chariot? Who walketh upon the wings of the wind? Who maketh his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire? Who laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be removed forever? Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up by the mountains. They go down by the valleys, unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound, that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. He sendeth the springs into the valleys, which run among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild asses quench their thirst. By them shall the fowls of the heaven have their habitation, which sing among the branches. He watereth the hills from his chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of thy works. He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth, and wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread which strengthens man's heart. The trees of the Lord are full of sap, the cedars of Lebanon, which he hath planted. Where the birds make their nests, as for the stork, the fir trees are her house. The high hills are a refuge for the wild goats, and the rocks for the conies. He appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knoweth his going down. Thou makest darkness, and it is night, wherein all the beasts of the forest do creep forth. The young lions roar after their prey, and seek their meat from God. The sun ariseth, they gather themselves together, and lay them down in their dens. Man goeth forth unto his work, and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. So is this great and wide sea, wherein all things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships, there is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. These wait all upon thee, that thou mayest give them their meat in due season. That thou givest them, they gather. Thou openest thy hand, they are filled with good. Thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die and return to their dust. Thou sendest forth by thy Spirit, they are created, and thou renewest the face of the earth. The glory of the Lord shall endure forever. The Lord shall rejoice in his works. He looketh them on the earth, and it trembleth. He toucheth the hills, and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. My meditation of him shall be sweet. I will be glad in the Lord. Let the sinners be consumed out of the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless thou the Lord, O my soul. Praise ye the Lord. That was some nice poetry there, wasn't it? But let's go into it a little bit and pick it apart a little bit. I hate to do that with poetry because it kind of ruins the poetry a little bit when you start dissecting it, but that's why we read it through, just to get a feel for the poetic nature of it, and now we'll just dig into it a little bit more. It's interesting that the psalm starts with the statement, O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty. So this psalmist is about to look at the whole creation, and this is his summary. That when he looks at that, he can tell that God is great. And God has told us in his word that no man is without excuse for belief. Even if you couldn't read, you could look up into the sky and you'd have to wonder how all that got there. We'll talk a bit about that later. But that's the overriding theme in all of this, that God is just great, and his creation magnifies his greatness. Verse 2, who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. You know, God is often referred to as light. Jesus is often referred to as light. And if you think about what light does, it basically exposes everything. So nothing can be secret in the light. You ever wonder why most crimes are committed in the evening? Because there is no light, right? People can get away with stuff. It's dark, you can't see well, it covers all kinds of evils. Light, on the other hand, exposes everything. And God has really nothing to hide. He has nothing to be ashamed of. So why wouldn't he want to have the light as an attribute of his being? You might think of 1 John 1:5 there. This is a message that we have heard from him and declare to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And I like that second phrase there. He says, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Have you ever thought about God up there in heaven just stretching out the universe? You know how vast the universe is? Man doesn't even know how vast the universe is. We have an idea, like as far as our instruments can detect things, and people have done calculations, mathematical calculations to figure out, how big the universe is, and they say it's continuing to expand, but nobody really knows how big the universe is and how God stretched that universe out. I remember during our VBS, one of the slides that we had in the teen class was talking about the creation. It was talking about how many stars and planets there are in the universe. Anybody want to take a guess? The number they came up with, and this is obviously not an exact number, it's a mathematically derived number, 200 sextillion. Now, what's a sextillion, right? Well, it's a 1 with 23 zeros after it. That seem like a pretty big number? You could also think of it as a trillion times a billion, a trillion billions. Here's an illustration. 200 sextillion. Elon Musk, supposedly the wealthiest man on the planet, or the second, depending on what day it is. Sometimes he's the richest, sometimes he falls down, depending on how stock does. But anyway, his net worth is somewhere around $200 billion. If you took that $200 billion and put it in a pile, you would need 1 trillion of those piles to come up with $200 sextillion. I mean, I don't know if that helps you at all. It's just, it boggles the mind how big that is. And that begs the question to me, why? Why is that all there? Is that really necessary? I can only come up with one reason. Because God wanted it that way. Because God is infinite, God is boundless. Why wouldn't He? He has the ability to make all those things. Why not? Would the Almighty God, with all that power, make one little planet and be done? No. I mean, I've never heard a better explanation of why that's all there. People will try to tell you how it got there, the Big Bang and all these other things, but why? Why does there need to be all that? Well, I think because God wanted it to be there and it pleased Him that it would be there. So that's why it's there. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about, when you look up in the sky, you can see only a tiny little fraction of God's creation. Even if you got great eyesight, even if you got a high-powered telescope, you're not going to come anywhere near seeing those 200 sextillion planets and stars out there. Verse 3, who layeth the beams of his chamber in the waters, who maketh the clouds his chariot. I love that. Who walketh upon the wings of the wind. God created the waters. He created the waters to be at a certain place. He created clouds that refurbish that water so that there's this infinite supply of water. And He controls the wind. Now, the interesting thing about this is, God has the ability to control the wind. That doesn't mean that every time we get a hurricane, that's God pushing a hurricane somewhere. He has set into motion this autonomous process that kind of takes care of itself. Some things are going to happen. Winds develop, based on the temperature of the water and different things. That's all part of the system that God built. So His hand is not necessarily in every weather event that you see, but it could be. If God wanted there to be a hurricane, He certainly can override that process and make that happen. Verse 4, who maketh His angels spirits, His ministers a flaming fire. What I love about this psalm is He includes everything. He doesn't leave anything out of this psalm as far as God's creation. Here He's talking about angels. We don't often think about angels as being created beings, but they are. They were created by God. And those angels can take many different forms. We see a couple of those in the Bible. We see them appearing as humans. We see them appearing just as light, as warriors. They could even appear as wind or fire sometimes. But God created all of those. How many angels are there? I don't know. Probably about as many as there are planets. I don't know. I have no idea. Nobody knows. All we know is there's a great host of angels. God created them all. Verse 5, who laid the foundations of the earth that it should not be removed forever. We hear a lot of stuff these days in the news about climate change, right? That's like the big $2 word. Every time you turn on the news, somebody will be talking about climate change, climate change. Is the climate changing? Probably. Does man have the ability to override God's plan as to when the planet is going to come to an end? No. Although they think they do, they don't. God has a plan. He knows when the end of the world is going to be, and no man is going to make that come sooner or later than God wants it to, regardless of what they tell you. How long has this planet been sustaining itself? Thousands upon thousands of years. If God wants that to continue for another 1,000,000 years or 5,000,000 years, it will. And whatever he has to do to make that happen will happen. So we need to not be so arrogant that we think that, man is in control of the universe. He's not. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be good stewards. We should. But we're not in control of the universe. God is. Verse number 6, thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. Once again, I'm going to skip this one a little bit because I'm going to talk a little bit more about the water a little bit later. At thy rebuke, they fled. The waters he's talking about here. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away. I don't know if you get the gist of that, but what it's basically saying is that God, just through speaking, can make the waters rise, fall, whatever the case may be. You remember that story in the New Testament when the apostles were in the boat and the sea was very rough and they thought they were going to sink and the wind was blowing and the waves were all over the place? And Jesus rebuked them for their lack of faith. He was right in the boat with them there. And he spoke, and the winds calmed down, and the waters calmed down, and the apostles were like dumbfounded. In fact, they even said, they marveled, saying, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? So Jesus even demonstrated that power that he had as the Son of God over nature. And of course, God has that same power. Pretty amazing. Verse 8 and 9, they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. Now we hear a lot about the polar ice caps are melting and they're going to melt and it's going to flood the whole earth and we're all going to be goners. And this is supposed to happen in the next 10 years, the next 20 years, depending on who you talk to, the next 50 years, whatever. Is that really going to happen? Do we really have to worry about that? Well, if you believe what God said, then the answer to that question is no, you don't need to really worry about that. Recall Genesis 9:11, written down there. God speaking, and I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. So a flood is not going to destroy the earth. God has promised that. So water levels may rise, they may sink from time to time, but that's not something we need to be overly concerned about, that we're all going to be drowned because of a great flood. God has promised that won't happen. Let's keep moving along. Verse number 10, 10 and 11. He sends the springs into the valleys which run along the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild asses quench their thirst. So now the psalmist is turning from the planetary creation that he was talking about. Now he's focusing on the creatures, and there are many. He starts by praising God's design of how the creatures are all able to sustain themselves by what God has put there for them. The water, the food. I looked this up, and I don't know how accurate it is, but I was thinking, like, how many species of animals are there in the world, on the earth? Of course, you get different answers, but the one that seemed like it was the most reasonable, possibly, it was estimated at 8.7 million species. Now, there are things lower than species. There are subspecies and other different divisions below a species. Our biology teacher could tell us that here, right, Larry? But 8 million species of creatures on this earth. Not only did God create all of those, He also created a system for every one of those whereby they would be able to sustain themselves. From the lowliest little mosquito to the largest whale and everything in between, God invented and designed that process that they could all have food and nourishment to sustain themselves. I don't know if you can really get your head around that. I have a hard time getting my head around it. But it's pretty incredible. And it should cause us to be in awe of God's power, not only His power, but His intelligence in His design. This is not some haphazard thing that, God snapped His fingers and it just happened. This is a very thought-through process that God put into place here. And that's pretty awesome. Verse 12, by them shall the fowls of the heaven have their habitation, which sing among the branches. I'm throwing out a lot of numbers to you today. Here's another number for you. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 different species of birds. Each one of those birds has a distinct song, a distinct chirp, whatever you want to call it, and a distinct coloring. Now, if I gave you a homework assignment and said, go home and record with your mouth 10,000 different bird sounds, how good do you think you'd do? How close would you come to 10,000? I could maybe do 10, 20, I don't know. But next time you're sitting in your backyard, listen for that. You'll hear different birds. You'll see different birds. Maybe you won't see them, but you'll hear them. Each one has a slightly different call, and that's how they communicate with each other. Even something like that, we would take that for granted, right? You would never give it a second thought. You hear birds singing, yeah, nice, they're singing. 10,000 different species of birds, and every one has its own little voice. That's pretty amazing. Verse 13, He watereth the hills from His chambers, the earth is satisfied with the fruit of Thy works. Charles Spurgeon, in his book, The Treasure of David, made this comment. The result of the divine work is fullness everywhere. The soil is saturated with rain, the seed germinates, the beasts drink, and the birds sing. Nothing is left unsupplied. In other words, God thought of everything. Nothing is lacking. No creature is lacking in anything. God thought of it all. Pretty amazing. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth. So, not only does God supply water for His creation, He supplies food as well. We often give thanks for our food, right, before we eat or something, but do we really think about how that food came about, how that food is perpetuated over and over and over again? How many chickens have you eaten in your lifetime? Probably too many to count, right? Well, there's always chickens. How does that happen? There's always plants. There's always animals. God put that process in place that keeps that cycle of life going. And if you think about how many creatures there are on the earth, and I don't think, this one I don't have a number for. I don't think anybody can figure this number out. If you thought of every single creature that is alive on the earth today, from the insect to, the mammal, how much food does that require to keep all of them alive? A lot. Where does all that food come from? It comes from the process that God put into place, where animals are dying, they become food for other animals. Trees die, they become fertilizer for other trees. It's all a cycle, but it's really quite wonderful when you think about it. And all of that is there so that we can survive. God gave us more avenues for survival than he did other creatures. Like if you look at a coyote or something, they have a very limited diet. They eat basically meat. They feed on animals, and they don't really eat vegetables and fruit and all this other stuff. We have all of this stuff at our disposal that God put there for us. No other animal really has that. We have such a variety of things that we eat, and it's all put there by God for us. Verse 15, and wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread which strengthens man's heart. So now the psalmist is turning away from the animal kingdom. Now he's focusing on the human population, which, by the way, is God's highest creation. That statement would be argued by evolutionists. They would argue that we just happen to be the latest step in the process, right? Maybe 1 million years from now, something better than a human will come along. But that's not what God says. God says we were created in his own image, so I'm not sure how we could get that much better, because we're already created in God's image. So think about that when you're sitting down for your Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow, about all the things you see around that table, how all of those things got to be there, how you can pretty much count on all those things being there pretty much next year and the next year and the next year, assuming that you're here. But those things are going to be there because God invented that whole process. I keep saying that, but it's something that just amazes me, that God put that process into place where we never have to worry about any of that. Look at Genesis 1:28 that I put down there. And God blessed them and said unto them, he's talking about humans now, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth on the earth. So we have dominion over all of those creatures, which is a pretty big responsibility, but it's also a pretty big blessing. Let's move along here. The trees of the Lord, verse 16, are full of sap, the cedars of Lebanon, which he planted. I've never been to Lebanon. I've never actually seen a cedar of Lebanon except in pictures, but it's supposedly one of the largest and biggest spreading trees that are out there. And when you look at one of those, you kind of get a feeling for God's greatness. I don't know if you've been down to downtown Jacksonville where they have that heritage tree, I think they call it, don't they? It's like this huge, big oak tree. It gives you a feeling for God's grandeur. But I think Smith puts an interesting twist on this. I put a little quote there from the Smith Bible Dictionary. He gives an interesting comparison. He says the cedar of Lebanon, is a type of the Christian, being evergreen, beautiful, aromatic, wide-spreading, slow-growing, long-lived, and having many uses. You ever thought of yourself as a cedar of Lebanon? It's an interesting comparison. If we're not all those things, we should be as Christians, right? We should be evergreen. We should be always faithful. We should be wide-spreading. Our knowledge should be, widening and spreading. So it's pretty interesting. So next time you look in the mirror, see if you can see something that looks like a cedar. If you do, you might need to comb your hair a little better or something. I don't know. Where the birds make their nests, as for the stork, the fir trees are her house. The high hills are a refuge for the wild goats, and the rocks for the conies. So he's talked about how God gives water to his creation. He's talked about how God gives food to his creation. Now he's talking about how God provides homes for all his creation. Did you ever stop to think about that? All those millions and billions of creatures have a home. The fish have a home in the sea. Lions have dens. Birds have nests. They all have homes. We all have homes. Once again, God did not leave anything out. He thought of everything. And the homes for those animals are exactly where they need to be for them to survive in the best manner. Let's move on to verse 9. I grouped all those together there, verse 19 through 23, because they're all kind of one thought. He appointed the moon for seasons, the sun knoweth his going down. He makes the darkness, and in his night, and all the beasts of the forest do creep forth. The lions roar after their prey and seek their meat from God. The sun rises, they gather themselves together and lay down in their dens. Man goes forth unto his work and to his labor until the evening. So what's happening here is there's this 24-hour cycle where some animals are awake while others are asleep, and others are asleep while others are awake. Why is that important? Because it reduces the competition for food. The hunters, the animals that are hunting at night, don't have to compete with all the other animals that hunt during the day. Brilliant. Who thought of that? You know the answer. Verse 24, O Lord, how manifold are thy works. That word manifold, if you change that I to a Y, it might help you understand it better. How manyfold, how many are thy works. In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. He's talking about, once again, how incredible it is that there are so many creatures on this earth. And once again, the same question I asked about why there are 200 sextillion planets and stars out there. Why are there millions of species of animals? Are those really all necessary? I think my answer has to be the same, because I can't come up with a better answer. Because God wanted them there. God created them for his own pleasure. And that's why there are so many different animals. They don't need to be there necessarily, but God designed them. In Genesis 1:31 says, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So God was pleased to have all of those animals there. Verse 25, so this great and wide sea, wherein all things creeping, innumerable, both small and great beasts. So now the psalmist is turning away from man and the terra firma, and now he's going to the sea and all of the incredible creatures in the sea. I also used to always like, back in the day, watching Jacques Cousteau specials on TV. He was the underwater explorer. And one of the things that amazed me most is when they get in these little submarines and they go down to the very deepest part of the ocean. I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a part of the Pacific Ocean called the Mariana Trench. It's the deepest part of all the ocean, and it's something like 7 miles deep. 7 miles deep. Can you imagine how much water that is? You go for, I don't know, what's 7 miles away from here? Like Target, maybe down at the other end of the, I don't even think that's 7 miles. That's a huge amount of water. And the pressure down at that level is, what I wrote it down here, I just lost my place. It's 8 tons per square inch. You would be crushed immediately if you went down there. Your life would be gone. It'd be over. You would implode. There are creatures that they have spotted down there with their little submarines that actually survive in that. How do they do that? I don't know, but they're some of the most fascinating creatures you've ever seen. Some of them are luminescent. It's very dark down there. Obviously, 7 miles down is pretty much complete darkness. But they can survive down there. It's amazing. And they were specifically designed to be able to survive down there. They didn't just happen to be there. Verse 26, there go the ships. There is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. That word Leviathan is a pretty interesting word. It's translated in a lot of different ways. Ron Driver Briggs, which is the Hebrew lexicon for the Old Testament, says a sea monster or a dragon or a large aquatic animal, perhaps the extinct dinosaur Plesiosaurus, that big giant. Smith says the crocodile is most clearly the animal denoted by the Hebrew word, and Easton says any large animal that moves by writhing or wiggling the body, like the whale, the monsters of the deep. So it could be any of those. I think what he's trying to express here is the sheer size of that animal. Once again, here's my question. Why does the whale need to be as big as it is? Survival? That whale could be half the size and it would still be the biggest creature on earth. Why does it need to be as big as it is? Because God wanted it to be that big. Now, scientists would not accept that answer. They would not appreciate that answer. But they don't have a better answer. Why did the whale grow that big? It didn't really need to. It could have been half that size and it still wouldn't have had any natural predators. Let's keep on moving here because we're running out of time. Verse 27, these wait all upon thee. Thou mayest give them their meat in due season, that thou givest them, they gather. Thou openest thine hand, and they're filled with good. Thou hidest thy face, and they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die, and return to their dust. Now that last statement there might seem depressing to you, because we're all going to die, and we're going to return to the dust someday. I don't know if that shouldn't be a depressing thought, especially for us Christians. We have no reason to be afraid of that. But we need to just understand that that's the cycle that God put into place. Can you imagine if things didn't die? Can you imagine how crowded this planet would be? If no one that was ever here and no creature that was ever here had ever died? We'd have dinosaurs out in the parking lot. I mean, it would be utter chaos. That process has to happen, and God sustains it all. You know, and the thing about it is, it's amazing to me, too, that, you know, we've seen the human population grow over the course of thousands of years from in the millions to now somewhere around 8 billion people. But guess what? They're all still living. They're all still feeding themselves. They all, for the most part, have water to drink. Now, there are a few exceptions, but those are usually natural things like droughts and things that happen. But all of those people, as the population grows, they didn't just like stop being able to sustain themselves. The earth kept supporting them, and it continues to support them. That's pretty amazing to me that there's no end to it. Verse 30, thou sendest forth thy spirit, they are created, and thou renewest the face of the earth. So this is that idea again, how the earth is constantly renewing itself. Plants die and become new plants, etc., etc. It's a wonderful circle of life that God invented. The glory of God shall endure forever. The Lord shall rejoice in his works. And here's that verse I was talking about from Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. The they here is the non-believers. If you can't look at what's around you and marvel at it and think that there must be a designer who designed all this, and that designer can only be God, you have no excuse. What more could God have done? Okay, first of all, he gave us his creation, which defies explanation. He gave us his holy word that we could learn about how that all came into play. What more could he do? I don't know what more he could do. Do you want him to like knock on your door and give you a personal invitation to read his word or to look up in the sky? I think he's done everything he could do. It's up to us to appreciate and understand that. He looketh on the earth, and it trembleth. He touches the hills, and they smoke. So once again, God has control over all of those features of the earth. There's a hill there today. If God doesn't want it there tomorrow, he can remove it. And the last few verses there, the psalmist is just telling how, upon his meditation of all these things, the conclusion that he came to. I will sing unto the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. How can you stop praising God for all that he's done? You just shut that off one day? How does that happen? People do it, apparently. People fall from the faith, but I don't know how they do that. How do you just stop appreciating all of that? The psalmist says, don't let that happen to you. As long as you live, sing praises to God for his wonderful creation. My meditation of him shall be sweet. Verse 34 there. I will be glad in the Lord. So here's that concept of the meditation again, to really think deeply about what God is expressing through this psalmist about his creation. Really meditate. Don't just think about it. Meditate on it. Turn it around in your mind and really give it thought. And you'll come to a better appreciation of how wonderful it is. And finally, verse 35, let the sinners be consumed out of the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless thou the Lord, O my soul, praise ye the Lord. That word consumed there might mean something different than what you would think it would mean. When it says let the sinners be consumed out of the earth, when you think of consuming, you think of like just, destroying, like an animal consumes his prey. He just destroys it. But really the word consume there means to complete, to perfect, or just to cease. It doesn't really mean consume like burned up or destroyed. It just means merely come to an end. So the psalmist is saying, those evildoers that don't want to give God the credit for this wonderful creation, they're going to get their due reward. Their life is not going to continue in heaven. It's going to, he's asking that they would not be able to have the same life that we have as believers. So, for Thanksgiving, I hope this is giving you some food for thought, some things to meditate on, and to be thankful for, because it's a wonderful blessing that God's given us.